So I'm here with Professor David Starkey. Now, David Starkey is a famous TV historian. He's been a professor for a very long time. He's written a lot of books about the Tudors, that's his speciality, but he's also very vocal on politics. He's appeared on Question Time and various other mainstream programs. So we're going to pick his brains about the 2019 election and what it means for our country. Does Boris's election win last week represent a people's revolt against the establishment?
I think it does. I think it represents it in so many ways. I think, first of all, this is a vindication for the good sense of democracy, the notion that there is a wisdom in crowds. You don't normally hear about the wisdom of crowds in the Garrick Club, but I was having lunch there yesterday and I met the former Bishop of London, and we know each other quite reasonably well, and I said, amazing, isn't it, a victory for democracy? He said yes, and a victory for patriotism. And I think that's what it really was. And this raises a whole series of questions. Why did it happen? What paved the way to it? And I think we've now got to start rejudging referenda. The necessary background to this were the popular verdicts, the winning of 2 referenda. We've forgotten about the first one. It was the one that said we were not going to replace the first past the post system by some kind of proportional representation. Now that's the fundamental step, because proportional representation leads to multiple parties, leads to the fact that you have no clear verdicts in general elections, and instead you have squalid dealing in, they're no longer smoke-filled rooms, after the election, what it happens over almost all continental Europe. So that first popular vote, and then the second popular vote is, of course, the Brexit referendum. There was then the pullback, the disaster of the 2017 election because of Theresa May, a complete unsuitability as a leader. I mean, the contrast between her and Boris, it's as though you sort of set up a little textbook exercise, you know, somebody who basically doesn't like people, who doesn't like meeting people, who isn't confident in defending an argument, who goes all sort of defensive and cross, as opposed to somebody who actually likes people, at least I know no one knows anything about Boris. He's very good at pretending to like people. He appears, which is all that matters, and there's an ebullience and an embracing about it. And the result was she lost a clear majority, and we entered this nightmare of a parliament, of a 2-year parliament without a clear majority. And do you know what happened? Our entire structure of democracy threatened to break down, because the way Parliament has behaved since the introduction of democracy, which is really, it's only just over 150 years old in Britain. It only comes in with Disraeli, the Tory leader in the 1860s, extending the franchise to the reasonably prosperous working man who had his own house. And that's the key moment. And at that point, you change Parliament, you change how it works. You make it that every MP has got to stand on a party ticket. There is a party manifesto. When they get to the House of Commons, they are whipped by the whips. They've got to vote as their parties tell them to. And at the same time, you change the whole way the House of Commons works, so you give the government domination over the Commons. And you know what? That's the necessary guarantee of democracy. And with the 2017 election, with John Bercow, with Dominic Grieve, with that whole collection of arrogant, self-righteous pseudo-liberals in the Tory party, it looked as though the whole structure of our parliamentary democracy was going to collapse. And you saw Parliament not acting as a vehicle of government, but a vehicle to stop government, a vehicle to stop a popular verdict, deliberately setting itself to overthrow the referendum. And you know what? Came Boris, came 2019, and it's as though it's like a transformation. I mean, Boris is very good at pantomime, and it's like one of those transformation scenes in pantomime. You know, suddenly the winter landscape is torn apart, the lights come up, it suffuses pink, and there is Boris glowing like a baby elephant in the middle of it, and we're in a different world. It's a populist world, and it's rather appropriate to be doing this for the Sun. It's a vindication, but it's a good sort of populism. It's not a ranting one. It's not a racist one. The Tory party has returned to doing what it does brilliantly. It's marginalised the BNP. It's marginalised the Brexit party in favour of a broad, solidly based, national, confident party, which for the first time, I think, since the late 19th century, is a genuine national party. You know, it embraces my area of the countryside. I was born in a northern council house outside Kendal. My parents come from Oldham, the horrors of that, you know, deindustrialised belt. That is going solidly conservative, and we can bridge the gap.
There's a lot to get in there. I think let's touch upon the 2017 to 2019 Parliament. How do you think history will remember those MPs in that Parliament in that 2-year period?
It should remember them with deep shame. It should remember them with deep shame for 3 reasons. The first thing is, every single way, we're talking about the Tory MPs, the Tory Remainers. If we're talking about the Tory Remainers, people like Dominic Grieve, Oliver Letwin and Soubry, all of them were elected on a manifesto which actually had the phrase in it, that no deal is better than a bad deal. None of them challenged that. None of them, in their communications with their electorates, ever said, we don't actually believe that. They campaigned on that manifesto, and then the moment they're in the House, the moment the marginality of May's position becomes clear, what do? They set about reversing it. Now, if when they'd stood in an election, they'd said, well, actually, we don't really believe this, we don't believe that no deal is better than a bad deal, they would have had a measure of honesty. As it is, they were wholly and absolutely dishonest. They lied to their electorates. They then do something else. They betray their party. The only way parliamentary democracy can work is with political parties and loyalty to political parties. Again, Disraeli understood this. I mean, he is the genius in terms of both political practice and, very unusually, an analytical skill. He combines, he's a novelist, so he's got the gift of language, but he's also got a gift of observation and an extraordinary ability to summarize things. And he makes this point about the need for political parties and political discipline. Otherwise, parliaments don't work. So they betrayed their party. And then the third thing they betrayed, although they thought they were vindicating it, they betrayed Parliament, because they turned Parliament into a vulgar talking shop. They turned the British Parliament into Rome on Thames, the disgrace of the Italian Parliament, or the disgrace of the Spanish. And these parliaments that represent, as it were, immature systems of democracy that have never learned to work properly. Because again, I often take people round the great buildings of Westminster. Obviously, I'm a historian. You're standing on 800 years of history. There's that astonishing moment when the young Churchill, Boris is very fond of Churchill, when the youngish Churchill, in the middle, the absolute depths of the First World War, when his own policy in the Dardanelles had been a catastrophic failure, when it looks as though the British Empire is at risk of being defeated by Germany, he takes this young MP into the Commons chamber. It's empty, it's at night, and he says to the young man, "This is why we're going to win." And what is remarkable about the British Parliament is that it's survived. We tend to think that parliaments are natural. Parliaments are a very fragile form of government. Virtually everywhere in medieval Europe, France, the Netherlands, Hungary, Poland had a parliament. But do you know what? They were all abolished, because they got in the way of good government. They all behaved exactly as the Grieve, Letwin, Cooper-led Parliament did from 2017 to 2019. I mean, it was almost so these are people who betray the 3 Ps. They betray the people, they betray their party, and they betray Parliament. And I'm going to say something else. In any other country but ours, their behavior would have been described as treason. They deliberately undercut a national position in negotiation with a foreign power. Now that should be the final badge of shame. It puts you in the same category, I'm afraid, as Jeremy Corbyn with his consorting with IRA terrorists. So it's triple shame, quadruple shame.
Brexit was a fascinating election in
That
2016.
was it very mild.
Well, and you know, it was almost the first time. I know you've talked about previous times to that, but it seems to me that that was one of the first times where the British underdog really spoke and actually had it out against the establishment for a long time, first time in a long time in history. And then obviously the establishment had their counter-revolution in 2017 to 2019, and now last week the British people had their say.
Socked it to them really hard. Yes.
Exactly. Has there ever been a point in history that you can remember where you've got this revolution, then you've got the counter-revolution, and then yet again you've got this revolution from the people?
Well, you see, I think the way in many ways to understand the liberal establishment, it's why also, again, it's very interesting to look at the parallelism of British politics and American politics. Everybody's pointing out the similarities between the vote for Trump. I was at the inauguration, and the hilarious Women's March the day after, where all of these respectable ladies went round wearing knitted vaginas on their head. It was one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. The parallelism between British politics and American politics, I think it's rooted in the fact that both of our countries had a fundamentalist form of religion called Puritanism. And the modern liberal is the direct descendant of the old nonconformist or Puritan. I was inoculated against this. I was describing a little bit about where I grew up. I was inoculated against this growing up in Kendal. My parents, although they were working class, were members of one of these extraordinary religious sects. They were Quaker. And Quakerism is a direct descendant of the Puritanism of the 17th century, and it's the meetings are still completely unstructured. The meetings for worship are completely unstructured, and you're supposed to get up and speak as the Spirit moves you. And even as an 11-year-old boy, I can remember sitting there in this very beautiful stripped room with the enormous round-headed Georgian windows and the pattern of light creeping over the floor, listening to these people and thinking, isn't it extraordinary that God reads the Manchester Guardian? And that's what it is. And that self-righteous contempt for ordinary people, that sense that you don't argue with them, you simply tell them what is right, because you know better. This sense again that you know, the Corbynistas, the momentum, there's these eyes of staring fanatics. You look at somebody like Owen Jones or Ash, whatever she's called, they're fanatics. They would burn you in a second. They believe in heresy. They believe that, you know, if you actually disagree with what they say, it's not simply a matter of intellectual disagreement. You are fundamentally wicked. And they would put you in a gulag in a second. This is the authentic Puritan approach. This is, you know, why you have the witch trials in Salem, and is why this phenomenon of woke, this phenomenon of PC, social justice, is really almost peculiar to the Anglo-Saxon world. You don't find anything like it in continental Europe. There's nothing that resembles it at all. And do you know what? What we've had, therefore, is just like a rerun of the Civil War. You have the Puritan victory, you have the regime of the major generals, you have abolishing Christmas, and then you know what? There comes along a restoration, and it's wonderful. What do we do to the Puritan leaders? We chop their ghoulies off, pull their guts out, chop them in four, and string up the remains, you know. And that, in a politer way, is what's just happened.
So let's talk about that in relation to the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Labour are now going through what they call a period of reflection. And you've got MPs on, let's say, the right of the party.
But just pause. Consider the sheer ludicrousness of the statement. Reflection is calm, is detached, is intellectual, involves honest assessment. Come on.
So we've got MPs on the right of the party, let's say, who are more, you know, the Europhiles, the Mary Creys, you know, who are now attacking Corbyn.
The Starmers and the Emily Thornberrys.
Right, and then you've got the Corbynistas who are going out. We shouldn't have promised a second referendum. They're attacking what they see as the Blairites. Why did Labour lose? And are there any leadership candidates that you see now for the Labour Party that could win a general election?
Why did Labour lose? Well, of course, right, this is very interesting, and then we need to turn round what I'm going to say now and apply it to the Tories. All political parties, especially in the first past the post system, have to represent a coalition. They're a coalition of views, which is why you talk about broad church. They're also a coalition of different sections of the electorate. And at the moment, the Labour Party has got had two absolutely irreconcilable groups. In the north, you had the socially conservative, though sometimes leftish in the sense of belief, above all, in the national religion of the NHS and the council house, and, if you like, old-fashioned 1945 style Labour. That was the northern vote, and that was a vote that went solidly for Brexit. It's also, and this is something northern working class myself, though it's well concealed, this is something that, again, is really important. This is an area of profound patriotism. These places are the bedrock of the army. It's where the privates come from. It's where the barracks are. It's where the old regiments are. I mean, I know about this from my own family. My grandfather on my mother's side was a passionate working class Tory. He, although he was in his 30s, volunteered in the First World War. He had been one of the people who returned Churchill for Oldham, his first parliamentary seat, in 1900. And both my father's elder brothers volunteered actually before the outbreak of the First World War. This is just visceral. Right, so that's the one half of the Labour electorate. What's the other half of the Labour electorate? Well, the other half of the Labour electorate is the woke, not very successful graduate. They're on the whole not very successful because they're not earning big salaries and they've studied rotten degrees. And the other half of it, of course, are highly successful lovies and media people who earn enough not to worry, whatever the level of taxation. And they, of course, are the absolute classic in the formulation of David Goodhart. They're the classic anywheres. These are the ultra-liberals, the believers that the nation is a wicked thing, that patriotism is a vulgar disease, and particularly in the form of English nationalism is a badge of absolute shame. Again, George Orwell summarizes these people brilliantly. He says that the typical British intellectual would prefer to steal from a poor box in church rather than to stand up for the national anthem. Look at Mr. Corbyn. Now, these two electorates are completely irreconcilable. And Corbyn, of course, found himself deliciously torn apart on this. On the one hand, because he's an old lefty, he sees the EU as a capitalist conspiracy, so he wanted leave. But all his intellectual sympathies, I'm using the word very, very loosely when I talk about Mr. Corbyn's intellectual sympathies, and all his idées fixes, that's the better word, are with the woke. Because again, you see, the way you've got to understand Corbyn has never had a serious idea in his head. He leaves school with absolutely no qualifications, and then he goes immediately on a gap year, and that gap year freezes him. He is a permanent gap year student with all the silly beliefs of a gap year student, which is why, lying out a little bit of hash, a little bit of smoke, lots and lots of Latin America, deep resentment of the United States and all the rest of it. So he is then fundamental and hating Britain, loathing the country in the authentic intellectual fashion. So you've got...
And he doesn't read. I don't know if you knew that. He doesn't read.
I do know. I wrote an article on this. His first wife testified. She was married to him for 4 years and he never opened a book. His head is simply stuffed with received lefty opinion. His head is just stuffed with propaganda. And this is why he is so hopeless in public discourse. He cannot, the only audience that Corbyn can address is an audience of his supporters. He's got to have people round him who make him feel warm. The moment he's with an audience that's not necessarily hostile, but is just questioning, wants to know is why he's hopeless with journalists. So I think that the Labour Party then, at the moment, is absolutely unrescuable. That is to say that there is nobody in it at all who can bridge that gap. I think that providing Boris really does deliver on this Disraelian style, one nation Toryism, the North is lost. At which point your entire electorate is the woke graduate electorate of the South. And of course, as they grow up and get richer, they're not going to want radical socialism. So this notion that there is an inevitable drift to the left, which of course was one of the reasons why you had David Cameron. Do we understand why you had Tory modernisation? Tory modernisation was the most preposterous notion that has ever been invented. It was based on the idea that if you give enough foreign aid, if you say basically fuck off to your party membership by endorsing gay marriage, at which point the Tories will become the party of choice for people who read The Guardian. Now, just put those two statements together. It was Tory modernisation was a deranged notion, which is why it never delivered, backed by people like Danny Finkelstein of this parish, which is why it never ever commanded a serious majority and couldn't have done. And the Labour Party finds itself in a very, very similar position because, you know, if it chooses one of those funny northern ladies that you can't really understand who claim to be supporters of Corbyn, they will try and defend an extreme left position, but they won't carry the vote of the North. If you have Keith Starmer, or God help us, Emily Thornberry, you'll have the vote of Islington, you'll have the vote of Canterbury, in other words, university towns in the south. You won't have much else.
Boris famously wrote a book on Churchill.
And not a very good one, yes.
A lightweight one.
Really lightweight, yeah. Unlike Boris, yeah.
And you know, there are several leaders, British leaders throughout history, who one might describe as significant. You know, you've got Thatcher, you've got Blair, you've got Attlee, you've got Churchill. At what point will we know Boris is one of those significant leaders?
I think he already is. Bizarrely, I would never have predicted it. Not only did I make ungenerous remarks about his book, which I'm sure as a writer he will loathe me for. I hate it when people say nasty things about my books. But I thought, and indeed I wrote in the Telegraph, that I was asked to do the point of historical comparison, and I said the leader that he most reminds me of is Charles II. That's to say, somebody who's essentially driven by his prick and doesn't believe in anything and can't really understand anybody else who believes in anything, and therefore will be happy to double-cross everybody. I was proved absolutely and comprehensively wrong. So whether it is Boris, whether it is Dominic Cummings, whether it is the chemistry between the two of them, we've seen something totally remarkable. We've seen, first of all, a genuine, here, hats off, genuine Churchillian flair in leadership. The decision to go absolutely all out for Brexit bears a very striking resemblance to Churchill in 1940. The decision, we will not only have war, but we will declare, remember, it was lunatic in 1940. He says Churchill says the war aim is German unconditional surrender. Now that's lunatic in 1940, and yet it worked. And you saw instantly the complete change of political atmosphere at that point. I'm an enormous believer in the importance of individuals in politics. That's why I study Tudor monarchs. That's why I'm a biographer as much as I'm a historian, and never has there been a clearer illustration of it. So the first genius was to go, we will have one policy, and everything will be directed to that policy. The second stroke of genius, which everybody criticised deeply at the time, not me, was to throw out from the party the Greaves and the Letwins and all the rest of it. In other words, to say, because they had been the triple traitors, they'd betrayed the people, they betrayed the party, and they betrayed the parliament, and they were trying to betray their country, there is no place for you. And you then produce a political party which focuses on which as it were, focuses without challenge on the main thrust of government policy. And what's the effect of that? you then cut the knees off Farage. And so you had, first of all, a decisive stroke of strategy. We will go for Brexit. And then you had a decisive stroke of tactics. You cut off the opposition to the right, and you unify, which, we've now got the breakdown of the opinion polls. They show this very clearly. The Leave vote held together, the Remain vote fragmented. And then finally, you fought what I must admit I thought was a pretty awful general election campaign, but it banged home that simple, basic point. And there's an article by Boriss in today's Spectator saying you need crude metaphors, the business of putting, I was going to say buns in the oven, but I think that might not have been, the pie in the oven, the ready baked and whatever. And it seemed to work. But of course, I think fundamentally what happened was something different. The nation looked at Boriss and thought, well, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. And it looked at Corbyn and said, not on your life.
So Boris has this fantastic opportunity now, potentially, to be the great reformer, the new Disraeli, as you've mentioned a lot in this interview. Let's talk about some of the reforms that he might be thinking about doing. Let's start on the civil service, which is something I'm fascinated in. I mean, the civil service has been part of what I see, and maybe what you see, as this kind of liberal establishment over the last, not just 2 years, but decades before that. Whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy in various departments, civil servants seem, to me, to be uniform in their belief of this kind of liberal, as they would see it, liberal kind of, cult religion. And Dominic Cummings has been briefing various newspapers that he's planning on completely overhauling the civil service, making it far easier to sack people, bringing in experts from the outside. The civil service are already in uproar. We can't do that. We can't waste time doing that. It would be a complete disaster. What's your view on that specific reform, and then we'll go on to the other reforms?
Well, I think the specific reform has got a degree of purpose to it. I think equally we mustn't simply politicise the whole civil service. I think, on the other hand, there is a very powerful case for a kind of intermediate level. That would be the American model, and it's disastrous. I think there's an intermediate stage that we could look at of somebody sort of straddling the position between a senior civil servant and a junior minister. And I think that's the level. In other words, you would want people more senior than the SPAD. The SPAD is basically your age, kind of young and great. But I mean, there's youth has its limits, and so I think I would much welcome that. But I think there's a more fundamental point. The civil service, like the BBC, is absolute, and this is particularly true of foreign policy, is completely wedded to this view that nationalism is vulgar, that the notion we should pursue a national interest. The number of times I've heard the argument from friends and colleagues, because of course all of this stuff penetrates the universities as well. It is our duty to be in Europe. It is indecent to be pursuing national advantage. We have a common interest. Or this weird notion, which was actually advanced by, I think he was the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office, that we owe a duty to the third world as much as to our own people. This is mental derangement. Again, and Boris is going to have to think very hard about this. There's a very important, but I think very wrong-headed leader in today's Spectator, which is saying that this is a triumph of liberal conservatism. No, it's not. And if it's a triumph of liberal conservatism, he will lose the North. Liberal conservatism reached its peak under Cameron. That's both with the coalition with the Liberals, with Nick Clegg as Deputy Prime Minister, and in the year that Cameron had as Prime Minister, with George Osborne having franchised his brain to George Osborne. And that liberal conservatism was represented by two things. It was represented, first of all, by the decision, as I said, to cut the knees off the Tory party membership. I'm gay, as you know, but by this preposterous decision to make the Tories the party that legislated for gay marriage. That was a willful imitation of Blair. In other words, his Clause 4 moment. And I think that fundamentally misconceives the nature of the Tory party membership. What's very striking, is why did we get Boris Johnson as the leader of the Tory party. It was not the parliamentary party. The parliamentary party did not want him. It was instead the mass membership of the Tory party. And if you compare the complete opposite of the decision of the mass membership of the Labour Party to go down this catastrophic factional route and produce Corbyn, the wisdom of the crowd, of the solid, serious, sensible membership of the Tory party returned Boris. Because I don't believe this myth that we've been sold, that both our political parties have gone to extremes. The Labour Party has gone to extreme. The Tory party is its good, sensible self that it always has been, and that vindicates it. But you see, Cameron didn't believe that, and he didn't like it. So you have that one supremely silly decision to force gay marriage on the party. More importantly, you have this stance in foreign policy. You decide Britain is going to be the only country that follows the United Nations recommendation as to whatever percentage it is of GDP goes on foreign aid. And you know what? I think that was one of the most disgraceful decisions ever taken, because of course it was coupled with austerity. So whilst you were cutting, creches at home, whilst you're ripping up library services, whilst you're starving the NHS, you are throwing money at NGOs who spend their time impregnating the poor people of Haiti. It's monstrous. So I think the first thing that Boris should do is close down the Department of Overseas Aid, fold it into the Foreign Office, knock the heads of the Foreign Office together, that their job is to do what Disraeli understood, what Salisbury understood, what Churchill understood, and pursue a clear, direct policy of national self-interest, as of course Macron does without even thinking about it, as does Merkel, although she misunderstands it. And this notion that we have this duty, that our duty as the inheritors of empire is to set the standards for the rest of the world. Look where the folly has led us. So I think there's got to be a conscious pulling back from that. And I think the Tories should again, for once, actually take a leaf out of Blair's book, and they should be as ruthless about replacing the heads of quangos, every institution to which the government has nomination, clear the lot out. Put sensible, solid, conservative people there, or sensible, solid, middle ground people there, if there are not many of them, but we could try and find them, and do that. Otherwise we're lost, because if we continue to allow, because the Tories are quite gentle people and we don't believe in purges, but if we're going to continue to allow the universities and teaching and the media to be taken over by the anywhere, you see, liberalism is an extremist cult. We've got to understand that. And they're in the grip of an extremist cult. And I think the signals that Boris is sending out to, not directly to attack the BBC, it's quite clever, simply decriminalise the licence fee. Let it die a slow, starving death. That'd be quite amusing.
Almost like a free market policy.
Yeah, well, no, nothing quite as extreme, just, in a sense, let the people vote.
Let's talk about another reform now. You've touched on the BBC there, so we can move on from that one. But the House of Lords, that's another huge one that people were talking about.
A scandal.
What's your view on that? How should Boris, take the House of Lords forward?
Well, he's proposing one very sensible thing, which is to, at the moment, the Lords is, the last Commons, between 2017 and 2019, the country had voted, whatever it was, 52, 48 or 47, whatever it is, in favour of leave. Parliament, the House of Commons rather, which isn't Parliament, the lower house, was something like 75% remain. The Lords is over 90%. In fact, I think Boris actually produced the figure this morning. Out of 800 and odd peers, only 50 are leavers. This is deranged. The gross overrepresentation of the Lib Dems. And again, I think that probably the House of Commons should pass a motion that requires effectively forced retirement from the upper house and use the Parliament Act to do it. And then to, you don't want the House of Lords to be merely a reflection of the House of Commons. There's no point in that. But the absolute the grossness of the unbalance is something that desperately needs correction. And it's bloated in size, and it's also stuffed with, failed politicians. The least impressive animal in the world is a failed politician.
So Tony Blair, you mentioned him there again. One of his reforms was to actually introduce the Supreme Court. Now, we've seen what they've done over the last sort of few months. What should Boris do? Should he scrap it?
Yes. I think that in fact, if I dare do a little bit of plugging, in next month's edition of The Critic, the new sort of right-wing journal, I wrote an article on why liberalism is poison. And Disraeli again understood this completely. The way liberalism works is to ground itself on French revolutionary doctrines of universalism, universal equality, of the universal rights of man, of the necessity for a single pattern of constitutions based on the separation of powers. All this stuff is phony. If you like, the Blair government saw itself as introducing all those things into Britain. So especially the doctrine of separation of powers, the Supreme Court was consciously, we will set the judiciary aside from Parliament, because of course Britain has never had the separation of powers. All the powers of English government, because that's really what it is, derived from the Crown in Parliament. So the Crown in Parliament was a supreme judge, it was a supreme legislator, and it was a supreme executive. And do you know what? It worked. We have the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords. Nobody ever accused it of kowtowing to the government. But it didn't regard itself as a constitutional court. It would have never done what the Supreme Court did over the prorogation of Parliament. Because again, that was based on a fundamental ignorance of the way the British Parliament works. It looked at the British Parliament in terms of this French notion. By the way, all bad ideas come from France. It's absolutely universally the case. It looked upon it in terms of this doctrine of separation of powers, and said the Parliament is the legislative. It is the supreme thing. Therefore, if the government interferes even for 2 days with the legislative process, this is wicked and all the rest of it. But of course, the whole history of the English Parliament is only survived because it was managed by the government. A parliament that isn't managed by the government behaves as it did between 2017 and 2019. It's just a bloody nuisance. And if Parliament had continued to behave like that, it would have been abolished. What do you think happened in France when de Gaulle shifted the constitution of the Fourth Republic to the Fifth Republic? You abolished a parliamentary system of government and you replaced it with a president elected by plebiscite. And that would have happened in Britain because it would have just become a permanent obstacle to government. And the Supreme Court is part of that process. Again, the demotion of the position of Lord Chancellor, because again it allegedly interfered with the separation of powers, has been a catastrophe. We've seen the whole structure of criminal justice, in particular in Britain, starved of money. That would never have happened if you'd had a powerful Lord Chancellor, like a powerful, legally educated, legally influential Lord Chancellor, like on either side of the political divide, like Derry Irving for the Conservatives, or Mackay of Cashfern Derry Irving for Labour, New Labour, or Mackay of Cashfern for the Tories. They would never have allowed that to happen. But when you have Liz Truss or somebody,
I want you to touch on the theme that you were mentioning there. I think that something's really interesting throughout this interview. You've been talking about sort of the woke left, the liberal extremism.
The same thing, really.
Right, and this Supreme Court is a fascinating example of maybe there's something early on of this kind of postmodernist view of we need to scrap all this stuff that's happened before in history and we need to introduce our new kind of almost what one might describe these days as cultural Marxism.
Or revolutionary.
Right.
Revolutionary. You see, this is what I think is utterly catastrophic. And it's one of the reasons why the young have been so bizarre about Europe, that and being bribed by the European Union with free travel and other such things. And they believe somehow that all their freedoms come from Europe or from the United Nations or from, God help us, the Labour Party. Whereas the truth is their freedoms come from British history. All of these things, and sorry, it sounds mad, but it's true, they're all invented here. That's what we talk about the mother of parliaments, the notions of representative government, the notion of the checks and balances on government, of the independence of the judiciary, of the freedom of property and security of property. All of these things emerge as part of our history. The commitment to freedom of speech, that extraordinary English commitment to individuality, which of course reaches its culmination in eccentrics like myself and like Boris. It's rather strange people, which is the key to our astonishing creativity in the natural sciences. You know, Trinity College in Cambridge has won more Nobel Prizes than the whole of France. And that's not because of EU money coming into British science, oddly. You know, it did happen before. We don't owe our freedoms to the European Convention on Human Rights. That was a rather bad essay written on how European powers were supposed to behave after the Second World War, modelling them on what was simply taken for granted in Britain.
So perhaps 2019 will be seen as the year where these kind of liberal Cameron Blairite reforms of all of our
should be wheeled back.
It's time. The fight back begins now.
But you see, I'm not sure Boris has yet understood this. And this is the point that I would really like to. We began by talking about populism and popularity. If Boris is to hold the North, it's not enough to put in a few railway lines. It's not enough to build some nice houses. That's not enough. What he's got to do is to show that he shares that sense of values. And the North regards all of this stuff as total rubbish. It hates it. And do you know what? It above all detests being patronised. It detests being sneered at. It detests being told it's thick. I mean, you know, that was again the great failure of the particularly the Labour campaign. And there was some, I'm sure you enjoyed yourself too, in my drunken stupor after election night, I scrolled through things like the Twitter feed, for which of course again is complete world, this idiot world. I scrolled through Owen Jones's Twitter feed. I have never laughed. I was quite sore with laughter. And you got things like, if I come across an elector whom I think is racist, I am going to call them out. And these are the people whose vote you need. And a Johnson Conservative government cannot be a Liberal Conservative government. There were aspects of the Cameron-George Osborne partnership that made sense, like the idea of the Northern Powerhouse, but there are equally other aspects of that legacy that have to be rejected. They have to be visibly rejected. The first thing that he should do, apart from the undercutting of the BBC licence fee by decriminalising it, the first thing that he should do should be the abolition of the Department of International Aid and its folding into the Foreign Office, but also the issuing of a clear formal instruction to the Foreign Office that its job is to support a policy of national self-interest. And there's nothing wrong with this. International relations is about the arbitrament between sovereign powers, each pursuing their own interest, we hope, in a peaceful and orderly fashion.
It's interesting you mentioned, calling Northern voters thick and racist. I mean, they've been doing that for the last 3 years, and then their response to the election defeat, worse since 1935, was to carry on calling voters stupid and racist.
Fact, to turn the volume up. But again, you see, this is all like religion. It is, you believe that people have to convert to the truth. And then instead of sort of saying to them, well, Jesus would like to save you and all the rest, you go, you are damned, you will go to hell. And they're absolutely surprised they don't turn up in church. But you see what I mean? The parallel is an absolutely exact one.
I want to hit on two last topics. So first of all, let's talk about Labour's the scale of this defeat, because it is the worst since 1935.
I think it's worse in the sense of in 1935 the class basis of Labour held. What we've now seen here, it's a double point. We've been rehearsing all the specific reasons about patriotism and whatever, but the whole class basis of British politics has fundamentally and dramatically changed in a way that reverses not only 1945, it's bidding very fair to reverse the period between 1918 and 1924 in which the Labour Party overtook the Liberal Party as the natural party of opposition. The class basis of politics has gone. The groups amongst which the Conservative Party enjoys its largest majority are the two lowest social economic groups. This is to stand politics on its head. Completely on its head, and the whole, of course, vanishing of large-scale industry, apart from things like railways and whatever, which are the last redoubts of trade unionism, I think leaves the Labour Party without a serious national class basis. Instead, there will be a hot competition between the Liberals and Labour for the woke university town, parts of London, parts of Manchester, parts of Liverpool, larger city vote. But there's another thing which we haven't touched on, which we should have done. Again, this notion that the BME vote, the black minority ethnic vote, is solidly against the Tories is manifestly not true. And it was one of the things that I thought was most missing, for obvious, I imagine, sensitive reasons, from the YouGov survey of voting patterns. But it has to be clear that very important ethnic groups are now voting solidly Conservative. I would reckon, and this is a guess because the figures aren't in the public domain, if they've been taken at all, I would guess that what we're seeing is what I would call the successful immigrants, the Hindu, the Chinese, the Sikh, are increasingly and in overwhelming numbers voting Conservative. And you're leaving rumps of the Muslim and the black vote as the final redoubt of Labour territory. And this is producing, again, completely unexpected voting patterns. I reckon, that was one of the things that saved Boris in Uxbridge.
So there's been an elephant in the room in this interview, and I know that you've talked about Scotland in the past. You've compared the SNP to the Nazi Party in the past.
In the gentlest, kindest way. The gentlest, kindest. Well, they're a national party. They're a nationalist party.
Right. I mean, I think that was the point you were trying to make.
Yeah. I thought making very forcibly. I don't try to make a
Exactly. Now, obviously, Boris, we've talked about all the successes he's had, and he's got this great chance to reform. But there does seem to be one problem that he does have, and that is Scottish nationalism. So, do you think that Boris will be the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom?
There's a distinct possibility, because again, you see, it seems to me that what we've seen now here, and again, it's something that highlights Disraeli. Again, Disraeli always talked about England. Boris, the patriotism we're talking about is really an English patriotism, which has dared not speak its name. Because, of course, Britain was a very, very peculiar construct. It's the coming together of England and Scotland in the Act of Union of 1707, which deliberately leaves Scotland with all the elements of nationhood, a separate church, a separate educational system, separate money issuing rights by its banks, and so on. The Queen even changes religion when she goes over the border. Everything apart from a separate parliament. So it left Scotland with the whole machinery of national identity. And there was a moment in the 18th century when, think of rule Britannia, Britons never will be slaves. There was a moment in the middle of the 18th century when some thought was given to trying to produce a single uniform British identity, but it was very quickly abandoned. The monarchy leads the way. Every royal prince from the coming to the throne of the House of Hanover is given an English title, a Scottish title, an Irish title, and in the 20th century, a Welsh title as well. You've got three distinct orders of chivalry. You've got the Garter in England, you've got the Thistle in Scotland, and you've got the Patrick in Ireland. The royal visits, particularly in the 19th century, with, of course, Victoria and Albert, glorying in that kind of shortbread box, Scottish nationalism and whatever. But the most important thing is the failure at the end of the 19th century when you first of all introduced national state education. In France and Germany, under Bismarck and under Jean Jaurès in France, the national education policy is used to enforce a single uniform nationalism. And in England, Britain, we don't do that. We add on to existing systems of Anglican education in England, of nonconformist education in England, of Jewish education, of Catholic education, of Presbyterian education in Scotland. So the whole thing is just a chaos of fragments, which again is one of the reasons I think we're so wonderfully creative. And then when competitive sports are introduced, the four nations all fighting each other. So Britain has only ever really existed looking outwards. It only ever really existed with reference to the empire and to foreign policy. The moment that's gone, well, I would regret it. I think, as even speaking as a northerner with all that secular hatred of the Scots, I would deeply regret the fragmenting of Union. I think it would have terrible consequences for Scotland. It would do very little to England. It would have terrible consequences for Scotland. Scotland before Union was a benighted hellhole. Let's really face it. The thing that leads to the glories of the Scottish Enlightenment, to the wonders of 18th century Edinburgh and so on, is union with England. Remove that and you're back in the Middle Ages.
Two more questions. What can Boris do to save the Union? Is there anything he can do?
Continue his generosity, and I think simply show what he's doing in England. Because if what he's doing in England works, if the areas of deprivation in the north are really rescued, or at least if it will take more than 5 years, if at least a beginning is made to rescue them, if the continued improvements of education of the poorest sections of the population continue, if we continue to integrate immigrants with the extraordinary levels of success that we have done, I think maybe the Scots will look and maybe think, well, perhaps we stay. And if, above all, we manage to arrive at a sensible accommodation with the European Union, I refuse to call it a sensible accommodation with Europe. That's something completely different. Sensible accommodation with the European Union, and as I would predict, it makes no economic difference whatever. The Scots will then have to think very hard. And the Scots, to repeat a commonplace, are a canny people. An independent Scotland at the moment would immediately move into a huge balance of payments deficit. It would see an enormous deficit on the current account. That's to say, it spends far more than it would actually earn from Scottish taxation because of the Barnett formula and all the rest of it. And it would have then it would not be welcome in the European Union. It would almost certainly, it would have to try to use the pound, but why on earth should the British government support the Scottish pound? The English government, rather, support the Scottish pound. It would probably find itself, like Ireland, before Ireland joined the EU, only much worse off. And would the Scots really want that? How can I say? Because again, let's finish on this note. The Brexit vote was not a rationing vote. It wasn't a vote about making us better off. It was deeply irrational, because human beings are irrational. The notions of identity and of nationhood, they're as irrational as my falling in love with you or as just quarrelling now. They're human. And the Scots may very well feel, and I would completely understand it, that what they want is self-government. That is, after all, the great legacy. It's the great legacy of the English-speaking people to the world. We are the only empire that created a spawn of self-governing states. America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the sort of so-called Five Eyes of international security and whatever. And I would well understand it if the Scots decide, okay, we'll be poorer, but we'll be free. But that's a calculation they have to make.
Now, to finish the interview, I think that there's one fundamental truth that I've learned in my short period of being alive, And that is that old phrase about, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I think that phrase would really sort of get under the fingernails of Jeremy Corbyn or the postmodernists or the woke left.
They hate history. They think you can rewrite the world from scratch. And you see, this I think is the fundamental error. You can't. Our characters are shaped by the past. They're shaped by our culture. They're shaped by our national experiences. And the attempt at obliterating it or overriding it invariably leads to disaster.
So from taking that fundamental truth, what's your advice to Boris so that he can keep this majority, stay in power for a very long time and really reform the country?
Read Disraeli. Look at what Disraeli has to say. Disraeli believes that you have to reform constantly because we're a progressive country, but you have to reform in accordance with the traditions, the national traditions of Britain. And that is a really good test point. Look at that hard, think about it. For example, the national health. The national health has become, with all its defects, which are terrible, like any free system, it depends on queuing. I know, I was born with club feet and polio. I spent the first 4 years of my life in and out of hospital. These were in the glory first days of the NHS. And do you know how it was handled? How an hospital appointment was handled? You and your mother were summoned at 9 o'clock and frequently waited until 6:30 because it depended on queuing. Now, that does not fit with the modern world. The world of consumerism. Throwing all the money at the NHS that they're proposing to do will not change that. They have somehow got to combine their belief in the NHS as a new part of the establishment, a kind of new Church of England, the religion of the English. They've got to combine that with a genuine attempt at reform and refinance. And the little bit of advice that I would give to them is go back again, not so much look at Disraeli, but look at Beveridge. Beveridge, the Beveridge report, what he wanted to do was to make it a genuine insurance-based system. And how about, as an experiment, fusing private medicine back into the NHS? That, I think, would solve virtually every problem. But it demands a boldness of Dominic Cummings. Great to review defence, that's not going to make the difference. It will be, can they sort out the NHS in a way in which the people in the north will feel comfortable with, those who depend on it will feel comfortable with, which at the same time will mean that it no longer just depends on crisis and queuing. That will be the real acid test.
David Starkey,
A pleasure.
thank you very much.